Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the panel on Federation here at GraphQL Summit for 2020. I will be your moderator today. My name is Jeff Hampton. I am Director of Solutions Engineering. I work with our prospects and our customers from a field engineering standpoint. Not a salesperson, I'm an engineer. And I know our panelists today fairly well. I'm going to skip introductions. We have a very short period of time here, and you can see their titles. There's information that's been posted on the site. So let's go ahead and hop right in. And what I'll do for each of these questions, I will go ahead and use the same order every time. So we're going to start with Will, and we'll go to, Uri or Uri?
Uri, but Yuri. It's okay.
Uri, okay. And then Tejas, and then we'll do Stephen. Is that correct? Pronunciation's good?
Yeah, I'll just suggest for some of the questions for me to be a bit back because our use cases are sometimes a bit weird. So it's better to hear like the most common use cases and then.
Sure. I love a good weird use case. And I love to work at the Guild. So I'm excited.
Jeff, can you go Stephen before me?
Sure. I'll do Stephen before you. Okay. So first things first, what led you to choose Federation? So if we could start with Will, please.
Absolutely. So we chose Federation in the same time that we chose GraphQL, actually. We were running our services on Lambda, AWS Lambda, and we're beginning to expand internationally. So we found the big bottleneck on our services was that network communication. And as we go to parts of Africa, parts of China, where we're trying to optimize for latency, GraphQL was a key contender in reducing that payload size over the wire. So when making that transition to GraphQL, we had one of the engineers, Kyle, do some research and exploration, and Federation was just coming out. And that little piece of engineering us that was trying to try the new thing, jumped on it and haven't looked back since.
Fantastic. And you all, I checked your Crunchbase. I've been following you all. Congratulations on your success over the last year. So fantastic.
Thank you.
Uri, same question. What led you to choose Federation? Like, you have a slightly different perspective, I think. So
I think what led us to choose it is we're working with a lot of different companies, large companies like Microsoft or banks, airlines, things like that. And our goal was to introduce GraphQL as fast as possible, which is always hard. Like if GraphQL Federation is new, GraphQL is also new for most companies. And so we are kind of like using whatever we can in order to like overcome any barriers, whether they're technical or political in the organization in order to introduce something. And Federation was very helpful. Like, for example, if some part of the organization decided to go GraphQL, but decided to go with a different language, or something like that. And we needed to combine with that information, even though, sometimes they don't even want to use Federation, but we still want to federate their APIs and things like that. So Federation was very helpful there. And I'll just mention that we use Federation sometimes, the Federation logic on the client sometimes, and sometimes on a consumer service, and not necessarily a gateway. So, yeah. It was very helpful in many ways.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about that later. We have some interesting use cases too, so you and I should talk. Stephen, please.
Yeah, so for Netflix, it's been I guess kind of a journey to get to the point where we are now. So when you pull up the Netflix app, this UI, it's been using a Graph API for many years, since about 2013, which was when House of Cards first came out. But it's always been implemented as a monolithic API on this API gateway server that's then backed by microservices. And so this API gateway has evolved in architecture over the years, but it still serves the same basic purpose. It aggregates functionality that's distributed across a bunch of microservices. And it presents the UI with this single cohesive API. So the need to evolve this API gateway, it's primarily driven by scaling of the company. But when you think about scale, you usually think about the number of users. And so for Netflix, that's millions of people around the world binging latest season of Umbrella Academy. But there are other important dimensions as well. There's thousands of engineers that are contributing to the Netflix experience, and they contribute to hundreds of microservices. And then the number of developers and the complexity of the domain are really important dimensions of scale. And it's actually these latter dimensions that are what's addressed by this federated architecture. For an API gateway, often if you have more users, you can handle that just by spinning up more servers, and your AWS bill gets bigger. But integrating the work of hundreds of engineers is where that can be the hard part, and it takes time. It's GraphQL users probably know that. I mean, to design an effective API, you really need a deep understanding of the domain. And also to be efficient, an API gateway requires aggregation logic and strategies for caching and batching, and every new piece of functionality has to go through this process. And so as you scale as a company, as an organization, you run into this different scaling challenge, and that's the practical limits of a single API team. And so the team building the API gateway can end up becoming a bottleneck. And so we started exploring this federated architecture a couple of years ago in order to facilitate distributing the job of building APIs while preserving the abstraction for clients of a single unified API.
Okay. Just to make sure we get through our time, I'm going to move on. Tejas, do you have something specific to add to this question?
Yeah, so I was just going to add, very quickly, kind of while Stephen was working on, this Netflix side of things, we had similar experience on the studio side. And really, I think Netflix has a rich history of microservices. So there's approximately like about 100 backend services kind of just serving the studio domain. And that's where we found a really good fit for our GraphQL monolith to move to federation. And our exploration, we also considered running modules within GraphQL, which I think wasn't the best fit for Netflix because we have a lot of microservices, and developers tend to run then have to run both the module pointing to their microservice as well as the microservice itself. So hence we kind of went forward with federation.
Sounds good. Thank you, all of you. I'm going to combine two questions quickly so we can talk about the meatier ones. Can you quickly go around and let's say how many services do you have and what languages? And I understand some of this might be could be potentially sensitive or trade secret. So if you want to give me a general sense of what your scale is, that's fine too. So how many services and what languages, if you can tell me? And let's start with Will.
Yeah, absolutely. So today we run about 13 services in production, federated services in one federation, or RPM, requests per minute. How many requests we're handling every minute ranges from 100,000 to 600,000, depending on marketing notifications. That equates to about 100 million requests per day that we're handling, more or less. And our team is a team of 5 people. Yeah.
Wow. Nicely done. What languages? Are you TypeScript? Are you purely or?
TypeScript, yes. So TypeScript with a lot of Apollo code gen.
Okay, awesome. Gordy?
Yeah, so in our cases, I mean, there's a few different cases, but I think, let's say in terms of scale of developers, can range between like a couple of hundreds to even a couple of thousand developers. The interesting thing there is that many times in the organization itself, it sounds weird, but they use the same implementation language. So it might be like everyone is using, in order to write APIs, everyone is using Node, or in order to write APIs, everyone is using Java. Java is the most common one. In Microsoft, of course, is .NET. So they're using the same language. And there, I think we keep struggling with different ways, but in many ways there, we actually thought that the more we can do it build time, the more the merging and things we can do at build time, then it's better when we get a more consistent, a bit more performant, but mostly more consistent the behavior on production. But yeah, in our case, it's mostly like the concern was the amount of developers and a bit less the different languages part. But where every time there's something with a different language, with a different implementation language, which always comes up, then federation is like super powerful and super helpful there, for sure.
Right, because you can centralize that logic at the gateway ultimately for resolution. Yeah, and we have found the same here at Apollo. Sorry, Stephen or Tejas, which one of you wants to take this?
Yeah, I can take it.
Okay.
So on the languages side, we have kind of mostly on the back end, we have Java and Kotlin. So we use GraphQL Java heavily. And most of the backend services at Netflix are built in JVM-based languages. So Federation actually was a good fit for us, not because of the polyglot support, but more so for supporting our microservice architecture to contribute to a single unified graph. And in our case, the schema is owned primarily by the backend and the front-end engineers, a shared collaboration, while the implementation is owned by backend engineers. So we expect that pattern to continue. And maybe Stephen can talk about the scale, this number of services.
Yeah, so we're basically building two separate federated graphs, one for the Netflix app and one for the studio side, the Tejas talking about. And so we've been focusing first on the studio side. So that graph has been growing quickly over the last 6 months or so. We're up to, I believe, 50 services now contributing to that graph. And then of those, about 30 are in prod. Over the next quarter, it'll probably be about 30 more altogether. And then on the streaming side, it's just a handful of services where we start to apply federation to that monolithic API gateway.
Yeah. That is a good scale. I need to stack rank our next questions here, so bear with me for a moment. We've talked a little bit about, and Stephen, you especially, and I saw a lot of head nods around some of the challenges of federation. We find this to be the case are largely on the adoption side or the understanding side, and the spec itself is fairly straightforward, and I think that it's largely just GraphQL with a few specific directives. But what have you found to be the hardest part for people to understand as they adopt federation? And I think consumers largely can get factored out of this, although if there's something specific on the consumer side, I would love to hear it. So again, let's start with Bill.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the hardest part for us adopting was you needed understanding of the big picture, but you can only get the big picture understanding after you spend time doing. So you sort of have to blindly dive in, realize the mistakes that you made, and whoa, this should have actually been 5 services instead of 1 service, and then step back and break those down. So the hardest part is understanding what the final state should be without actually knowing a lot about the technology. And some of that you just have to build and then refactor.
Yeah, and that's the pattern largely that we've seen be most successful, is actually to start with a small monolith, at least in a POC. And as you go to do your architectural planning, start thinking about it as a monolith first, which runs counter to everyone's desire to be separated from concern, like separation of concerns and heavily microservices day one, but especially with 2 new technologies, right? GraphQL and federation on top. Yeah. Same question, Uri. Please, what have you found to be the hardest part?
I will split it up for 3 parts. One is, I think sometimes when people start using federation, I think the hardest part for us to explain is also that you don't have to use it. And there's some cases it's not necessarily, one fits all. The second thing is separation of concerns. In some cases, there were reasons why those teams are separated. There's sometimes now that you start linking those 2 together, there's a lot of questions of, who owns that logic? That linking logic might not necessarily fit into those linking services and those teams and the way the organization works and things like that. And the third thing I think is the separation between a gateway and a service mesh. So basically, what are we merging here? Are we merging multiple gateways for products, or are we merging multiple services? And I think when you get to that question, you need to ask another question, which is for, let's say, a specific service. First of all, does it need to be aware of other services? And second of all, even a larger question, which is maybe blasphemy, is like, is GraphQL the best protocol for that service? So I think those three subjects, we see people kind of like, because the amazing things in GraphQL and the amazing things in GraphQL Federation and all the amazing things Apollo is doing, everyone is jumping in super quickly. But then there's questions to be heard. There's also some other technologies in the world that are not related to GraphQL that are sometimes, solve some issues and sometimes in a better way or in a different way for specific use cases. So I guess those three parts are, I know we don't have a lot of time, so I guess I'll just leave it with that.
If you can join us in the topic room after this, everyone who's on the stream too, please, I would love to continue all these conversations. Stephen, please.
Yeah, I guess I'll say maybe the implementation details. When someone is implementing a service that's going to be part of the federated graph, there are some federation details that you do have to be aware of. Specifically, you have to implement this thing called an entity resolver, and it's basically just a single field that can look up anything in your graph. It's kind of like the node field if you're doing a relay server spec. But like the return type of this field is this union type that's automatically generated. And so it's kind of this implementation detail, but you do have to implement this resolver. And so you have to know a little bit about it. And I mean, we've worked on improving the ergonomics for developers, but there's still some challenges there.
Right. You can't avoid indexing. And I don't, in any data access model, if somebody comes up with a way, please let us know. Tejas. Oh, I think you're muted.
I was on mute. Yeah. So kind of one challenge we found people, to adopt Federation is around developer education. So I would say, previously there was a small team that owned the GraphQL server. Primarily it would be kind of the team that's implementing the graph. It could be on the UI side or maybe on the backend side. But what Federation actually does is it decentralizes the implementation of the graph, which means now every developer that contributes to the graph has to learn GraphQL first. And there is enough complexity in GraphQL alone that, learning the schema SDL, how to implement resolvers and data loaders, doing complex performance optimizations with look ahead. So now we found that it's difficult for developers to quickly go from the traditional API mindset of kind of REST or gRPC at Netflix to more of a, graph API mindset, because that's more product different, schema first, right? And on top of that, Federation adds a little bit more kind of learning curve, like Stephen mentioned, with the entity resolvers. So I would say developer education is a really big challenge to get the adoption going.
Agreed. We're almost out of time. We're coming down on about 7 minutes here, if I'm not mistaken. I think the biggest question we've been circling around, or at least the biggest topic that we're not really covering here is what do you wish was different about Federation? And especially given the unique perspectives of team size versus, sort of customer facing field engineering consulting, and then sort of this, unique scale. I think this is a great audience. So just generally, what would you like to see, or what do you wish was really, what's the sticking point around Federation? What do you wish was different? I'll start with Will.
I struggled with this one because I think everything has honestly been working extremely nicely for us. I think a very great opportunity in the market right now is to combine it with improve the analytics and monitoring, maybe embed it with APM. The fact that you're building distributed services adds a lot of complexity in operating those services. So if you can more out of the box get performance metrics at the query level for those services, understanding if you introduced or clients began to execute a highly unperformant query right off the bat, and having monitoring around that, because the complexity around distributed services definitely adds the operational overhead. And I think that's a space that's missing, and there's a lot of opportunity there.
I'd like to discuss some of that too in the topic room, and we need to have more forums like this. I think shameless plug. We've got some work on the studio side here at Apollo to address some of those things. So from a product manager perspective, I'd love to hear some feedback and some more detail there. Uri, please. What do you wish was different?
I'll mention a couple of things, and I'll also mention for each one a possible solution, maybe, to be a bit more optimistic. So first thing is around standardization. Like many times when we come into a company and we talk about Apollo Federation, I know Apollo is doing a lot of work to kind of like make Federation something that is more of a spec for the whole community. But we still see like people kind of like being scared a bit of like, putting something that and kind of like confirming many teams into a standard that maybe is, not yet a standard. So I think the path here is like we started talking with like people from AppSync and Hazura and other companies, like maybe we can work with Apollo to like actually increase adoption of that spec across the industry, just to make it feel for companies that it's like more, and I think Apollo probably is leading it, so we should talk. So that's one thing. The other thing is that this idea of one graph is, I think, extremely powerful, but many times there's many different types of consumers of that one graph. And for example, if I have a machine learning service that wants to consume that one graph, people don't necessarily want to confirm, to make this call go through some gateway or through some kind of essential service. On top of that, maybe some of the things that I want to connect to that one graph are teams that they don't know what GraphQL Federation is, and they don't have time to implement it, or they even don't know what GraphQL is. And that's a big problem because we want to connect them to the one graph, and we want to introduce, the sooner we'll get one graph into the organization, the adoption will increase and everyone will be, it's kind of like a chicken and an egg problem. Yep. So the solution, possible solution, which is maybe a shameless plug, is like we created this library called GraphQL Mesh, where we took the ideas of federation and we run federation, but in an SDK context, meaning I can do that merging of one graph, but I can do it as an SDK on top of one single, let's say, machine learning service. And the sources of that can be not only GraphQL federated services, but they could be just regular GraphQL services. And they could be even a gRPC or an open API service. And we automatically convert them into GraphQL federated services. And it kind of like creates like a one graph that is completely distributed. And each service each service can build their own graph basically in a distributed way.
And to be sorry to interrupt, I want to make sure that Stephen and Tejas have a chance to answer, but I'm not cutting you off for any other reason than that. I'm a big fan of GraphQL Mesh. I've been diving in lately, so I'd love to talk. We need to talk about it. We take that to the next room. Stephen, please.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that more in the next room. But let's see. So Federation, I guess I'll say that the devil's in the details, and the Federation spec could stand to be a little bit simpler. I mean, the basic concept is pretty simple, but there are some of the details the developer has to understand. And so, for example, using correctly in the right place the external directive or extends or requires, it can feel like a bit of a dark art for developers until you really understand how it all works. And it's definitely necessary to add these kinds of concepts to GraphQL. You need a way to identify like a primary key and a way to look up things. But I would love to see if we can refine it just a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's a tooling deficit there too, to be completely candid. And I think the community has an opportunity to be working, with those of us who maintain the spec and want to see it succeed. But also, I've seen some really fascinating examples out of our enterprise customers, data visualizations and modeling tools around federation that I'm hoping that we can surface. Tooling, tooling is the way out of this. So thank you all for all of your time. Tejas, I'm sorry we didn't get to you. We're going to move to the Federation topic room here in a moment, hoping to do some more live chatting. This has been extremely edifying. I know you all took time out of your schedule and time ahead of this to prepare. So thank you all so much. I appreciate your time and for sharing your success and your challenges. So cheers. I hope everyone stays healthy and well, no matter where you are in the world. And we'll see you in the next room. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.